Teacher suggests janitor solve a problem. Minutes later, all students applaud. The bell at Lincoln Elementary School rang at 7:30 in the morning, but Margaret Wilson had already been there for an hour, struggling with the same problem that had haunted her for 3 weeks. Sitting at her desk in the teacher's lounge, papers scattered everywhere, she chewed on the end of her pen as she stared at the numbers that seemed to dance before her eyes. "I can't take this anymore," she muttered to herself, running her hands through her graying hair which stubbornly escaped her messy bun. The problem wasn't simple. Principal Deborah Thompson had given an ultimatum the week before. Either the school found a way to drastically improve the 9th graders' math grades in less than 2 months, or the full-time program would be cancelled. That meant half the teachers would lose their jobs, including Margaret, who at 52 knew she'd hardly find another job. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson," came a familiar voice behind her. She turned and saw Robert Johnson, the janitor who had worked at the school for 15 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and kind eyes, he held a bucket and a rag in his left hand while pushing the cleaning cart with his right. "Good morning, Robert," she replied, trying to hide the desperation in her voice. "Sorry. For the mess, I'll clean up these papers soon. Don't worry, Ma'am, I noticed you came in very early today. Everything all right?" Margaret hesitated. She usually didn't share her personal struggles with school staff, but there was something about the calm, respectful way Robert always treated her that made her feel at ease. "I'm trying to find a solution to a very complicated problem," she said, nervously gathering the papers. "The 9th graders are struggling terribly with math. Their last test scores were disastrous, and if we don't improve them soon—" "Can I take a look?" Robert asked, setting the bucket down. Margaret looked at him in surprise. In all these years working together, Robert had never shown interest in the school's academic matters. He always did his cleaning efficiently and discreetly, politely greeting teachers and students, but keeping to his place. "Well, I don't know if—" she stammered, unsure how to refuse without being rude. "Sorry if I overstepped, Ma'am," Robert said, picking up the bucket again. "Just wanted to help." "No, you didn't overstep," Margaret said quickly, feeling guilty. "It was just, well, it's a very technical math problem." Robert nodded and moved away to start cleaning the room. Margaret turned her attention back to the papers but couldn't focus. Something about how Robert had asked the question intrigued her. It wasn't just politeness. There seemed to be genuine interest in his voice. 15 minutes later, as Robert was cleaning the window near her desk, Margaret made an impulsive decision. "Robert," she called. How far did you go in school?" He stopped cleaning and turned to her. "Up to sophomore year of high school, ma'am. Had to quit when my father got sick." "And did you like math?" A faint smile appeared on Robert's face. "It was my favorite subject. Always thought numbers had their own logic, you know, like they were a language few people truly understood." Margaret felt a strange tingling in her stomach. There was something in the way he spoke about math that caught her attention. "You know what?" she said, making a decision she would later consider one of the most important of her life. "Maybe you really could take a look at this problem." Robert set the rag aside and stepped closer to the desk. Margaret showed him the sheets with the data from the last 3 tests of the 9th grade students. "Look here," she explained. "These are the math test results from the past 2 months. The overall average is 3.2. To maintain the full-time program, we need to reach at least 7 by the end of July." Robert studied the numbers silently for a few minutes. Margaret watched his face, trying to decipher his expressions. He seemed to be calculating in his head, his eyes moving quickly between the different columns of grades. "Ms. Wilson," he finally said, "may I ask a question?" "Of course." "Have you tried identifying which specific types of problems are causing the most difficulty?" Margaret blinked. It was exactly the question she should have asked herself weeks ago, but she had been so focused on the overall numbers that she hadn't stopped to analyze the details. "No, not exactly," she admitted. "Looking here," Robert said, pointing to one of the sheets, "it seems the students do reasonably well with basic addition and subtraction problems, but struggle a lot when the problems involve reading comprehension and multiple steps." Margaret looked where he was pointing and felt her heart race. He was right. How had she not noticed this before? "What this means," Robert continued, is that the issue might not be with math itself, but with how the problems are being presented. Go on, said Margaret, now completely focused on his words. If the students can't interpret what the problem is asking, they'll never be able to apply the math knowledge they already have. It's like knowing how to speak English perfectly, but being asked to answer questions written in Japanese. The analogy was so simple yet so accurate that Margaret felt as if a light had turned on in her mind. My goodness, she murmured. You're right. I've been focused on teaching formulas and operations, but not on helping them understand what the problems are really asking. Robert nodded. Maybe if you started with simpler problems to interpret, using situations from the students' daily lives, they could connect math to their own experiences. At that moment, Principal Thompson walked into the teacher's lounge. A 55-year-old woman with dyed blonde hair, always impeccably dressed. She had a reputation for being strict, but fair. Good morning, Margaret, she said, but stopped when she saw Robert standing by the table covered in papers. Robert, shouldn't you be cleaning the hallways now? Yes, Principal, Robert replied, quickly grabbing the bucket. Sorry, I was just leaving. Wait, Margaret said quickly. Deborah, you need to hear what Robert just explained to me about the math grades issue. The principal raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He noticed something I hadn't. The problem isn't that the students don't know math. It's that they can't interpret what the problems are asking. Principal Thompson looked from Margaret to Robert and back to Margaret. Robert, she said, her tone giving no hint whether she was annoyed or curious. Do you have a background in education? No, Principal, Robert answered humbly. I just looked at the numbers and tried to understand what they were saying. And what exactly are they saying? Robert glanced at Margaret, who gave him an encouraging nod. Well, he began, choosing his words carefully. When I was a kid, my mom always taught me math using examples from things I knew. If she wanted to teach me division, she'd ask how many equal slices I could cut a pizza into. If she wanted to teach percentages, she'd talk about how much money I'd save on a bakery sale. Go on, said Deborah Thompson, now clearly interested. Looking at these tests, it seems the problems talk about things the students have never seen in their lives. Farms with thousands of animals, businesses with huge profits, situations very far from their reality. How can they get interested in solving a problem about something that makes no sense to them? Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. Robert was putting into words something she had known intuitively for years, but had never been able to express so clearly. That's very interesting, Deborah said slowly. Margaret, have you ever tried this approach? No, but now that Robert explained it, it makes perfect sense. I could try creating a sample test using problems based on our students' reality. Do it, said the principal, but I want to see concrete results in 2 weeks. Robert, thank you for your contribution. After Deborah left, Margaret turned to Robert. Thank you, she said. You may have just saved my job. I hope it works, Ms. Wilson, Robert replied, picking up his cleaning supplies again. Robert, she called as he was about to leave, would you like to help me prepare these new problems? I mean, if you have the time and interest. Robert stopped and turned slowly. Are you serious? Completely. You have a different perspective on this, and I think it could be really valuable. I'd really like to, Ms. Wilson, but I don't know if what? If it would be appropriate. I mean, I'm just the janitor. The way he said just the janitor broke Margaret's heart. There was a sadness in his voice that spoke of years of being underestimated and undervalued. Robert, she said firmly, you just solved in 15 minutes a problem I'd been struggling with for 3 weeks. That has nothing to do with your job title. It's about intelligence and insight. Robert's eyes shone for a moment. When would you like to start? How about this afternoon, after classes? We can meet here in the teacher's lounge. Perfect, said Robert, and for the first time since Margaret had known him, she saw a genuinely wide smile on his face. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The rest of the day flew by for Margaret. During her classes, she watched the students with completely new eyes. She saw how they tuned out when she started explaining abstract math problems, but perked up when she connected the material to their personal experiences. With her 9th grade B class, she decided to test it out. Instead of starting the lesson with the rectangle area formula she had planned, she asked, "Who here has helped their parents figure out how many tiles to buy for a bathroom remodel?" 3 hands went up. "And who's ever tried to figure out if their lunch money was enough for a soda and a bag of chips?" Nearly all hands shot up, accompanied by laughter. "Perfect," said Margaret. "So you've already used math to solve real problems. Today we'll learn how to do it more precisely." The difference was striking. Students who usually spent the whole class texting under their desks or whispering were paying attention. They asked questions. They participated. When the bell rang, Margaret felt more energized than she had in months. She quickly gathered her things and headed to the teacher's lounge, where Robert was already waiting. He had changed out of his work uniform into a light blue polo shirt and jeans, and held a spiral notebook in his hands. "Brought this to jot down ideas," he said, showing her the notebook. "Great," said Margaret, sitting down beside him. "Where should we start? Maybe you could tell me a little about the students first. How old they are, where they live, what their interests are." Margaret began talking about her students. Robert listened carefully, asking specific questions and jotting everything down in his notebook. He wanted to know about the students' families, their parents' jobs, the places they frequented, and the dreams they had. "Most of them live in the New Horizon neighborhood," Margaret explained. "It's a working-class area, but not a slum. The families work hard. Many parents run small businesses or work in factories. The students dream of finishing school. Some want to go to college. Others want to learn a trade." "What about money?" Robert asked. "Do they have any sense of values, prices, household budgets?" "Absolutely. Many of them work on weekends to help at home or to have their own spending money." Robert noted all of this down and then fell silent for a few minutes, thinking. "I have an idea," he finally said. "How about we create a story? A situation where the students need to use math to help a family like theirs solve a real-life problem?" "What kind of problem?" "For example," Robert flipped through his notes, "a family planning a Sweet 16 party who needs to calculate the budget, food quantities, space needed, that kind of thing." Margaret's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant. They'll completely relate to the situation." Over the next 2 hours, Margaret and Robert crafted a detailed story about the Smith family, who were organizing their daughter Grace's Sweet 16. The father, Frank, worked in a factory and earned 2 minimum wages. The mother, Reynolds, was a house cleaner and contributed 1 more wage. They had $500 saved for the party and needed to decide how to spend it wisely. "Now, let's create the problems," said Margaret. "But each problem has to include information the students need to figure out to help the family." "Problem 1, Robert said, writing in the notebook. "Frank found out he can rent a hall for $200, but has to pay a $50 deposit, which will be refunded if there's no damage. If he has $500 total, how much will be left for other party expenses, considering he'll get the deposit back?" "Perfect," Margaret said. "That involves subtraction, but also interpretation. They need to understand the deposit isn't an actual expense. They kept creating problems, each more engaging than the last. Robert showed impressive creativity in connecting complex math concepts to simple everyday situations. "Problem 5, he said. "Reynolds saw a supermarket deal. Buy 3 sodas, pay for 2. If each soda costs $3 and she needs 16 sodas for the party, how much will she spend in total?" "That's great for teaching proportions and logic," Margaret said. "They'll need to figure out how many groups of 3 sodas she can make and how that affects the total price." By the time they finished, they had created a complete test with 20 problems, all tied to the Smith family's story. Margaret was impressed not just by Robert's creativity, but by his mathematical understanding. He clearly grasped advanced concepts, even if he didn't have the technical vocabulary to describe them. "Robert," she said as they organized the papers, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Ms. Wilson." "Why did you stop studying? I mean, it's obvious you have a talent for it." The smile faded from Robert's face. "My father got sick when I was in my sophomore year of high school," he said. "Lung cancer. My mother had passed away 3 years earlier, so I was the Only one who could take care of him and work to pay the bills. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said sincerely. It was a long time ago. He lived 5 more years after the diagnosis, which was a blessing. But when he was gone, I was already used to working. I was 25 by then. It seemed too late to go back to school. "It's never too late," Margaret said impulsively. Robert smiled sadly. "For some things it is, Miss Wilson. I'm 42 now, raising 2 daughters on my own. I can't afford to dream." "Your daughters? How old are they?" "Bethany is 16, a freshman in high school. Chloe is 12 in 7th grade. "And do they go to school here?" "Bethany used to, but she transferred to the public high school. Chloe still goes here in the afternoon shift." Margaret made a sudden connection. "Chloe Johnson, from 7th grade B. That's her. She's one of the best math students I have. Extremely bright and always helps her classmates." Pride shone in Robert's eyes. "She takes after her grandfather. My father was an accountant before he got sick. Always said math was in our blood." "Wait," Margaret said, processing the information. "Your father was an accountant?" "Yes. Worked 40 years at the same company. He's the one who taught me to love numbers." Now Margaret understood where Robert's natural talent for math came from. He'd grown up in a family where numbers and calculations were part of everyday life. "Robert, can I make a suggestion?" "Of course. What if you went back to school, finished high school, and maybe even studied math or accounting in college?" Robert shook his head. "Ms. Wilson, I appreciate the encouragement, but it's not realistic. I work here in the mornings, at a bakery in the afternoons, and clean an office building 3 nights a week. When would I have time to study? There are night programs, weekends, and who'll take care of my daughters? Who'll pay the bills if I cut back on work?" Margaret heard the frustration rising in his voice and realized she'd been insensitive. It was easy for her, with a stable job and no children to raise alone, to suggest he completely change his life. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're right. I wasn't thinking about your reality." "No need to apologize," Robert said, calmer now. "I appreciate that you believe in me. It's been a while since anyone did." The next day, Margaret administered the pilot test they'd created to one of the 9th grade classes. The results were astounding. The class average went from 3.2 to 6.8. More importantly, the students seemed to have enjoyed solving the problems. "Ms. Wilson," said Jason, one of the students who usually struggled the most, "this test was different. I actually understood what you wanted me to do. And the Smith family's story felt so real," added Emily. "My own family went through something similar last year." Margaret could barely contain her excitement. When the students left for recess, she rushed to find Robert, who was cleaning the courtyard. "Robert," she called, trying not to shout from excitement. "It worked. What do you mean?" "The test. The average went up to 6.8. Robert dropped his broom and stared at her with wide eyes. "Seriously?" "Completely serious. And it wasn't just the grades. The students really understood what they were doing. They enjoyed solving the problems." Robert smiled, but Margaret noticed something restrained in his joy. "That's wonderful, Ms. Wilson. You did it." "We did it," she corrected. "This was teamwork." Just then, Principal Thompson appeared, accompanied by Mrs. Sullivan, the curriculum coordinator. "Margaret," said Principal Thompson, "Mrs. Sullivan told me you administered an experimental test yesterday. How were the results?" "Excellent. The average score went up by more than 3 points." "Really?" said Mrs. Sullivan, clearly surprised. "What did you do differently?" Margaret glanced at Robert, who was quietly stepping away. "I created problems based on the students' reality, situations they could relate to." "What kind of situations?" "A family planning a sweet 16 party, calculating the budget, food quantities, that sort of thing." "Interesting," said Principal Thompson. "Did you develop this approach on your own?" Margaret hesitated. She could easily take all the credit, and it would probably be the wisest move for her career. But she looked at Robert, who had stopped moving away and was clearly listening. "Actually," she said, "I had help from Robert." The 2 administrators looked at the janitor in surprise. "How so?" asked Mrs. Sullivan. "He helped me identify the real issue with the students' grades and create the new types of exercises." Principal Thompson exchanged a glance with Mrs. Sullivan. "Robert, called the principal. "Could you come here for a moment?" Robert approached, somewhat reluctantly. "Robert," said Principal Thompson, "Margaret mentioned that you helped her develop this new teaching approach. Is that true?" "I just gave a few suggestions, ma'am." "What kind of suggestions?" Robert looked at Margaret, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Well, I noticed the test problems were about situations very distant from the students. Reality. I thought maybe they'd be more interested if the problems were about things they know." "And how did you come to that conclusion?" "By looking at the test scores and remembering how I learned math as a kid." Mrs. Sullivan looked visibly intrigued. "Do you have a background in education?" "No, ma'am. I only studied up to sophomore year of high school." "But you're interested in the field?" Robert glanced at Margaret again before answering. "I've always liked math, and I've worked here for 15 years, so I know the students well." Principal Thompson was thoughtful for a moment. "Margaret, do you think you can replicate these results with the other classes?" "I'm sure of it. Robert and I are already working on new materials." "Robert," said the principal, "would you be interested in continuing to help Margaret with this project?" Of course, if it can be balanced with my work." "Let's see what we can arrange. Sullivan, schedule a meeting to discuss this in more detail." After the two walked away, Margaret turned to Robert. "Do you realize what just happened?" "I'm not sure." "They're considering making your role in the school's teaching project official." Robert shook his head. "Ms. Wilson, I can't fool myself. They're just being polite. In the end, I'm the janitor and you're the teacher." "Robert, you just solved a problem none of us could. That counts for something." "For now. But when the project succeeds and the grades really improve, who'll get the credit? Who'll be promoted or recognized?" The question hit Margaret hard because she knew Robert was right. In her 20 years of teaching, she'd often seen people taking credit for others' work, especially when differences in status or formal education were involved. "That won't happen," she said firmly. "I won't let it." Robert smiled sadly. "Ms. Wilson, you're a good person, but the world doesn't work that way. People like me don't get recognition for intellectual contributions. We get a pat on the back and maybe a year-end bonus if we're lucky. So what do you suggest, that we stop the project?" "No," said Robert quickly. "The project is important. The students deserve a better education. I'm just saying I know my place in all this." That night, Margaret went home thinking about Robert's words. She knew he was right about how the world worked, but it deeply troubled her. There was something fundamentally unfair about someone as smart and capable as Robert being limited by circumstances beyond his control. The next morning, she arrived at school determined to do things differently. When Principal Thompson called her to discuss the project, Margaret was ready. "Margaret," said the principal, "we spoke last night, and we'd like to expand your approach to all 9th grade classes. If the results stay positive, we might consider implementing it school-wide." "I'm very happy to hear that," said Margaret, "but I need to be clear. I can't do this alone. Robert is an essential part of the project." "We understand. He's contributed, but..." "No, Principal Thompson, you don't understand. He's not just contributing. He's the brains behind the new approach. He's the one who identified the real problem and is creating the solutions." The principal looked uncomfortable. "Margaret, I appreciate your loyalty, but Robert is the janitor. He doesn't have teaching qualifications." "So what? He has something better. He understands the students and understands math in a way none of us do. But how do we justify this to the Department of Education? To the parents? A janitor developing school curriculum? We call him a consultant, teaching assistant, special projects coordinator. The title doesn't matter, the work he's doing does." Principal Thompson sighed. "Margaret, I see your point, but there are protocols, hierarchies, expectations." "Then we change the expectations," said Margaret, surprising even herself with her intensity. "Principal Thompson, in 20 years of teaching, this is the first time I've seen real, meaningful change in student learning. Do you want to throw that away because of protocols?" The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan, who wore a worried expression. "Principal Thompson, we need to talk. Some parents have complained." "What kind of complaints?" "About the new math method. Some parents think the problems are too simple and that we're not preparing students properly for high school. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Which parents? Mrs. Adams, mother of Richard from 9th grade A, Mr. James Carter, father of Fiona, and Mrs. Parker, mother of the twins Paul and Peter. Margaret knew these parents well. They were all middle-class families who always had strong opinions about how the school should be run. What exactly did they say? That the problems on the last test seemed like child's play, that talking about Sweet 16 parties isn't serious math test material. Mrs. Adams said verbatim that she doesn't send her son to school to learn about poor people's lives. The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She'd spent years teaching these people's children, always trying her best, and now she was being criticized for finally finding an effective way to help all students learn. And how do you plan to respond to these complaints? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. We need to be careful, said Principal Thompson. These parents have influence in the community. If they start spreading that our school lacks academic standards, we could lose students. So we go back to the old methods. The methods that clearly don't work for most of our students. Not necessarily, said Mrs. Sullivan, but maybe we can find a middle ground. Keep some problems contextualized, but also include more traditional ones. This will confuse the students, said Margaret. The strength of the new approach lies in its consistency. The students finally understand that math makes sense in their lives, and now you want to mix it back with abstract problems? Margaret, said Deborah Thompson in a warning tone, you need to understand we have multiple pressures here. We can't just consider the students' learning. We have to account for community expectations, the education system's standards, external evaluation metrics. And where do the students fit into all this, Bud asked Margaret, feeling her frustration grow. Where are the children who, for the first time in their lives, are understanding math and enjoying learning? They matter, of course, said Mrs. Sullivan, but we can't ignore the other concerns. Margaret realized she was losing the battle. The same hierarchy and the same pressures Robert had predicted were playing out exactly as he'd said they would. I need some time to think, she said. Can I have the rest of the day to consider the options? So, of course, said Deborah, but we need a decision by tomorrow morning. Margaret left the principal's office feeling defeated. She had found something that truly worked, something making a difference in the students' lives. And now, she was being forced to abandon it because of politics and prejudice. She ran into Robert in the hallway, organizing his cleaning supplies. Ms. Wilson, he said, noticing her expression. Are you okay? No, she admitted honestly. Can we talk? They went to the teacher's lounge, which was empty during class hours. Some parents complained about the new approach, Margaret explained. They said the problems are too simple, that they don't prepare the students properly. Robert nodded slowly. And the board wants you to go back to the old methods. They want a middle ground, mixing both types of problems, which will completely undermine the effectiveness of the approach, said Robert. Exactly. Margaret looked at him. Robert, I'm sorry. I really thought we could make a difference. We did make a difference, he said calmly. For a few weeks, the students understood math wasn't some impossible monster. That's already something. But it's not enough, Margaret burst out. You have brilliant ideas. You understand education in a way most educators don't, and you're being ignored because you don't have a diploma hanging on the wall. Ms. Wilson, Robert said gently, I warned you this would happen. And you were right, but that doesn't make it any fairer. Robert stayed, silent for a moment, looking out the window. You know what frustrates me the most about all this? He finally said. What? It's not even the lack of recognition. It's seeing the students suffer again. I see these kids every day. I see how they feel when they can't understand the material. I watch their self-esteem crumble. I see them starting to believe they're dumb. And now we're going right back to that. Yes. And that hurts more than anything personal. Margaret looked at Robert and saw something in his eyes. That made her make an impulsive decision. What if there was another way? How so? What if you administered the test yourself? Robert stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Ms. Wilson, I can't teach. I'm not a teacher. Not officially. But what if you held a tutoring session, unofficially, for the students struggling the most? How would that work? You could meet with them after school, maybe on a Saturday, just to review the concepts using your approach. Robert shook his head. Even if I wanted to do this, where would it be? And would the parents allow it? We could use one of the classrooms. As for the parents, well, for the students who are really struggling, I'm sure they'd be grateful for any extra help. But would this go against school rules? Margaret thought for a moment. Technically, it would be like a study group. You wouldn't, officially, be teaching, just helping the students study. And would you participate too? If you'd like, or I could just help organize and let you lead. Robert fell silent, clearly processing the proposal. Ms. Wilson, even if this worked, it wouldn't change anything in the official school. The old methods would still be used in regular classes. Maybe, but at least some students would have access to your approach. And who knows if the results were obvious enough. The board might change their minds, Miss. It's possible. Robert sighed deeply. There are a lot of risks here. If the board found out and didn't like the idea, I could lose my job. That's true, Margaret admitted. I can't guarantee there aren't risks. And I have 2 daughters to support. I know, and I completely understand if you don't want to do this. Robert looked out the window again, watching some students in the yard. Let me think about it, he said finally. Can I give you an answer tomorrow? Of course. That afternoon, Margaret taught her classes with a heavy heart. It was hard to see the students engaged, asking smart questions about the contextualized problems, knowing she'd soon have to return to methods that left them confused and unmotivated. During 9th grade B's class, Jason raised his hand. Ms. Wilson, can I ask a question? Of course, Jason. These problems you're giving us now are much easier to understand than the old ones. Are you going to keep teaching this way? The question hit Margaret hard. How could she explain to a 15-year-old that the approach finally helping him learn would be abandoned? Because some parents thought the problems were too simple. We're studying different ways to teach math, she said, choosing her words carefully. We haven't decided which one we'll use moving forward. I hope it's this one, said Emily. My mum was surprised when I explained a percentage problem using the family situation from the test. She said she'd never seen math like this before. Other students began agreeing, sharing how they'd managed to explain math concepts to family and friends using the contextualized situations. Ms. Wilson, said Mark, a boy who was usually very quiet. Can I say something? Of course, Mark. I always hated math, always thought I was too dumb for it. But on the last test, for the first time, I understood what I was doing. I didn't just memorize formulas, I actually got it. Mark's words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She knew his story. The son of a single mum working double shifts, he'd repeated 8th grade because of low grades in math and science. I'm so happy to hear that, Mark, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. When classes ended that day, Margaret felt more determined than ever to find a way to continue the project, even if unofficially. The next morning, she arrived at school eager to hear Robert's decision. She found him in the teacher's lounge, arriving earlier than usual. Good morning, Ms. Wilson, he said. Good morning. Did you think about our conversation yesterday? Robert nodded and pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I made a list of pros and cons, he said, handing it to her. Margaret unfolded the paper and read, Proschakas, helping the students who need it most. Maybe changing the school board's mind if the results are good, using my knowledge for something useful, making a real difference in the children's lives. Showing that ordinary people can contribute to education. Cons, risk of losing my job. It might not work and cause more problems. A lot of extra work without pay could create conflict with other teachers. My daughters could be hurt. If I lose my job, that's a very honest list, said Margaret. What's your decision? Robert took a deep breath. I'll do it, he said, but with a few conditions. What are they? First, if at any point the school board explicitly forbids what we're doing, we stop immediately. I can't afford to. Disobey a direct order. I agree. Second, if I notice this is affecting my regular job or hurting my daughters in any way, I stop. That makes sense. And third, this can't turn into a big thing. No publicity, no drawing attention. Just a small group of students, quietly. Perfect. So how do we start? I've already thought about that, said Robert, pulling another paper from his pocket. I've identified 10 students from the 9th grade classes who are struggling. They're the most in math. If we can significantly improve their grades, it'll be clear proof that the approach works. Margaret looked at the list. She recognized all the names and agreed with Robert's selection. They were hard-working students, but consistently had low math grades. How will we invite them? I thought you could talk to them individually. Explain that it's an extra study group on Saturday mornings for those who want to improve their grades. What if they ask who's leading the group? You can tell the truth, that it's Robert, the school janitor, who has a knack for teaching math. Are you sure you want to be introduced that way? Robert smiled. Ms. Wilson, I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. If they want to learn from me, great. If they think it's weird getting help from the janitor, that's their problem. Margaret admired Robert's dignity. He wasn't trying to hide behind titles or credentials. He was offering his knowledge honestly and humbly. All right, she said. I'll talk to the students today. If they agree, we can start next Saturday. For the rest of the day, Margaret spoke individually with the 10 students on Robert's list. The reactions were mixed but surprisingly positive. Jason was the first she approached. A study group, he asked. But I already go to Mrs. Sullivan's math tutoring on Tuesdays. This would be different, Margaret explained. A new approach, using problems more connected to your reality. And who's teaching? Robert, the janitor. He has a special way of explaining math. Jason looked surprised but not negative. Robert, the one who always greets everyone in the hallway. He knows math. More than you'd think. Can I think about it and give you an answer later? Of course. The conversations with the other students followed similar patterns. Some were intrigued by the idea of learning from someone who wasn't officially a teacher. Others were desperate, enough to try anything that might help them improve their grades. Emily was the most direct. Ms. Wilson, if Mr. Robert can teach me math in a way I understand, I don't care if he's a janitor, an astronaut, or a popcorn vendor. I need to pass this year. Mark had an interesting reaction. Mr. Robert has always been nice to me. When I was upset about my low grades, he always found a way to say hello and ask how I was doing. If he knows math, I'm sure he'll be a good teacher. At the end of the day, 8 out of the 10 students had agreed to participate. Only 2 declined. One because they already had commitments on Saturday mornings, and the other because their parents wouldn't allow it. Margaret found Robert outside the school to share the news. 8 students are on board, she said. Shall we start next Saturday? We'll start, Robert confirmed, but she could see the nervousness in his eyes. Are you worried? A little, he admitted. It's one thing to sit here with you and work through problems on paper. It's another to stand in front of 8 teenagers and try to teach them something. It'll work out, Margaret said with conviction. You have something many teachers don't. You truly understand how these students think and feel. I hope you're right. Over the following week, Robert and Margaret met every day after school to prepare for the first study group session. Robert showed impressive dedication, bringing new ideas each day. I thought we could start by asking them about their biggest dreams, he said one afternoon. Then show how math can help them achieve those dreams. How so? For example, if a student dreams of owning a car, we can use that to teach percentages, interest, and budgeting. If another wants to travel, we can cover unit conversion, ratios, and distance calculations. That's brilliant, Margaret said, tailoring the lessons to each student's personal interests. And I also think it's important for them to understand that math isn't just for passing tests, it's a lifelong tool. Robert had clearly given a lot of thought to education, even without formal training. His ideas were intuitive yet sophisticated. On the Friday before the first session, Margaret was called into the principal's office again. Margaret, Deborah said, we heard you're running a math study group on Saturdays. Margaret's heart raced. How had they found out? Yes, that's right, she stammered. For students struggling with the subject, yes. We think it's a commendable initiative, Mrs. Sullivan said. It shows your dedication to student learning. Margaret sighed in relief. They didn't know about Robert's involvement. We just want to ensure you'll use appropriate teaching methods, Deborah continued. Nothing experimental or untested. Of course, Margaret said, guilt creeping in at the half-truth. Great. Good luck with the project. When Margaret told Robert about the conversation, he grew uneasy. Do they suspect something? I don't think so. But they made it clear they expect traditional methods. Maybe we should cancel. No, Margaret said quickly. We've already promised the students. Besides, technically I'll be there. If anyone asks, I can say you're assisting me. Isn't that lying? It's a creative interpretation of the truth. Robert didn't seem entirely convinced, but agreed to proceed. On Saturday morning, Margaret arrived at the school at 8 and found Robert already waiting at the door. He was visibly nervous, clutching a folder with their prepared materials. Ready? She asked. I think so, he replied, though his voice betrayed his anxiety. They went to the classroom Margaret had reserved for the study group, a smaller room with space for about 20 students, perfect for their group of 8. The students began arriving promptly at 8:30. Jason was first, followed by Emily, and by Mark. Within 15 minutes, all 8 were present. Good morning, everyone, Margaret said. Welcome to our math study group. Good morning, Ms. Wilson, the students chorused. As you all know, this is Robert, said Margaret, gesturing toward him. He's the one who's really going to teach you today. The students looked at Robert with curiosity but no hostility. Margaret felt encouraged. Good morning, everyone, said Robert, his voice trembling slightly at first. I know it might. Seems strange learning math from the school janitor, but I hope you'll give me a chance. We're here, aren't we? Said Emily with a smile. That's already giving you a chance. Robert visibly relaxed. Before we start with math, he said, I'd like you to tell me about your dreams. What do you want to do after you leave school? What kind of life do you want to have? The question took the students by surprise. They were clearly expecting to jump straight into numbers and formulas. It can be any dream, Robert encouraged. It doesn't matter if it seems impossible or if you think you won't make it. I just want to know what's in your hearts. Slowly, the students began to open up. Emily talked about her dream of becoming a nurse. Mark wanted to own an auto repair shop. Jason dreamed of being a soccer player but knew he might not be talented enough, so he also considered becoming a coach or sports commentator. Robert listened to each student with genuine attention, asking questions about details and showing real interest in their dreams. Now, he said once everyone had spoken, I'm going to show you how math can be a tool to achieve each of these dreams. He walked to the board and started writing. Emily, you want to be a nurse. Do you know how much a nurse earns on average? Not exactly. Let's find out together. And let's calculate how much you'd need to save each month to afford nursing school. Let's figure out how many hours a week you'd need to work to support a family on a nurse's salary. Emily's eyes lit up. Mark, you want to own a repair shop. Let's calculate how much it costs to set up a basic shop, how much you'd need to charge per service to make a profit, how to estimate the time needed for each repair. Seriously? Said Mark, clearly excited. Robert continued connecting each student's dreams to practical applications of math, percentages for calculating loan interest, geometry for measuring area and volume, statistics for understanding success, probabilities in different careers. Math doesn't exist to be difficult, said Robert. It exists to help us understand and organize the world around us. It's a language that lets us solve real problems. For the next 3 hours, Robert led the most dynamic and engaging lesson Margaret had witnessed in her 20-year career. He didn't just teach math concepts. He showed students how those concepts connected to their lives and dreams. He improvised problems on the spot based on situations the students mentioned. When Emily said her mum was considering moving apartments, Robert immediately created a problem about calculating whether the move was financially worth it, factoring in moving costs, rent differences, and proximity to work. The students participated actively, asked questions, suggested variations on the problems. For the first time, Margaret saw these students truly excited during a math lesson. Everyone, Robert said as it neared 11:30, let's wrap up for today. But before we do, I want to give you homework. The students groaned, but without real resistance. I want each of you to find a real math problem in your lives this week. It can be anything, calculating how much your family spends on food each month, figuring out which is the better deal at the supermarket, or calculating how many miles you walk in a day. Bring this problem next Saturday and we'll solve it together. Is this math homework? Jason asked, surprised. This is real life, Robert replied. Math is just the tool we'll use to understand your life better. When the students left, they looked noticeably different from when they had arrived. There was an energy and excitement that Ms. Wilson rarely saw after math classes. How did it go? She asked Robert when they were alone. Better than I expected, he admitted. They're really smart. They just needed someone to show them that math makes sense. You were amazing, Ms. Wilson said sincerely. I've never seen a lesson so engaging. Thank you, Ms. Wilson, but the real test will be whether they actually learned anything. Over the next week, Ms. Wilson observed the 8 students from the study group in their regular classes. The difference was remarkable. They participated more, asked smarter questions, and seemed less lost when she introduced new concepts. On Thursday, Emily approached her after class. Ms. Wilson, can I tell you something? Of course, Emily. My mum was impressed. Yesterday I helped her figure out whether it was worth buying the item on sale or the cheaper regular one. She said she'd never seen me interested in math before. That's wonderful to hear. And you know what's even cooler? I wasn't scared of the numbers. Before, when I saw a math problem, I'd freeze. Now I think, what real life problem is this trying to solve? On Friday, Ms. Wilson was surprised by an unexpected visit. Mrs. Reynolds, Mark's mother, came to the school asking to speak with her. Ms. Wilson, said Mrs. Reynolds, a woman in her 40s, clearly straight from work. Can I talk to you for a minute? Of course, Mrs. Reynolds. Is everything all right with Mark? Better than all right, she said with a smile. I came to thank you. Thank me for what? For what you're doing with my son. I don't know what happened, but Mark is different. Different how? He always hated math. He used to say he was dumb, that he'd never understand it. But this week he's been talking about math every day. Yesterday he helped me calculate how much we could save by buying in bulk. This morning he said he wants to start saving money to open his own shop in the future. Ms. Wilson felt a wave of emotion. He's always been a bright boy, Mrs. Reynolds. He just needed to find the right way to learn. I don't know what you did, but please keep doing it. My son has hope for the future for the first time in a long while. After Mrs. Reynolds left, Ms. Wilson felt more determined than ever to protect the project. No matter the school's policies or the board's pressures, she had seen the real impact Robert's work was having on these students' lives. At the second study group meeting, the students arrived clearly excited. Each had brought the real-life math problem Robert had asked them to find. Jason, let's start with you, Robert said. What problem did you bring? My dad's. Trying to decide whether it's worth buying a motorcycle to get to work or keep taking the bus, Jason said. He spends $20 a day on fares and works 22 days a month. The bike he wants costs $8,000, but he'd have to pay for gas and maintenance. Excellent problem, Robert said, walking to the board. Let's work it out together. For the next 2 hours, Robert used the students' real-life problems to teach complex concepts like financial math, ratios, and cost-benefit analysis. The students weren't just solving their own problems, but learning to apply the same principles to other situations. Emily, your question about which nursing program offers the best cost-benefit involves the same principles as Mark's problem about how much to charge for a service at the workshop, explained Robert. In both cases, you're comparing initial costs with future gains. Robert's ability to connect seemingly different problems and reveal the underlying mathematical patterns constantly impressed Ms. Wilson. He had a natural teaching intuition that many formally trained teachers never develop. At the end of the second class, Mark raised his hand. Mr. Robert, can I ask a personal question? Of course, Mark. How did you learn all this? I mean, you're not a teacher, but you explain things better than some teachers I've had. Robert smiled, clearly touched by the question. My father taught me to love numbers when I was a child. And then life taught me that math is in everything around us. Once you understand that, teaching becomes easier because you just need to help people see what's already there. Why aren't you a real teacher? Asked Emily. The question created an uncomfortable silence in the room. Robert glanced at Ms. Wilson, who gave him an encouraging nod. Sometimes life takes us down different paths than we planned, Robert said carefully. but that doesn't mean we can't use our talents to help people. I think you should be a teacher, said Jason. Seriously, you're better than a lot of teachers I've had. Thank you, Jason. That means a lot to me. After the students left, Ms. Wilson and Robert stayed behind to organize the materials. How did I feel about their questions? She asked. It was complicated, Robert admitted. On one hand, I'm glad they see value in what I'm doing. On the other hand, it makes me think about what could have been different if I'd had other opportunities. It's not too late, you know. Robert shook his head. Ms. Wilson, I appreciate the optimism, but I'm 42 years old with responsibilities. I can't start over now. Who said it would be starting over? It would be picking up where you left off. Before Robert could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Principal Thompson and Mrs. Sullivan appeared at the classroom door. Ms. Wilson, said the principal, how was the study group today? Very well, replied Ms. Wilson, trying to keep her voice calm. The students are participating actively. And you, Robert, said Mrs. Sullivan, what are you doing here? I was helping Ms. Wilson organize the materials, Robert stammered. What kind of help? Ms. Wilson realized they were on dangerous ground. Robert has been observing the classes and offering some helpful suggestions on how to better connect with the students, she said quickly. What kind of suggestions? Asked Principal Thompson, clearly suspicious. Well, he's known the students for many years, said Ms. Wilson, so he understands their interests, what kinds of examples make the most sense to them. I see, said the principal, though her tone suggested she wasn't fully convinced. Robert, could you give us a minute to speak with Ms. Wilson? Of course, Principal, said Robert, quickly leaving the room. When they were alone, Principal Thompson got straight to the point. Ms. Wilson, what exactly is going on here? What do you mean? Don't treat me like a fool. Robert wasn't just helping organize materials. There were formulas. On the board solved problems. He was clearly involved in teaching. Ms. Wilson took a deep breath. The moment of truth had come. You're right, she said. Robert has been helping with the teaching content. Helping how? He has a natural talent for teaching math. The students respond very well to his methods. Margaret, Mrs. Sullivan said in a warning tone, you can't have an employee without teaching qualifications instructing students. That goes against all regulations. But the results don't matter if the methods are inappropriate, Deborah Thompson interrupted. Margaret, you need to understand, there are legal responsibilities involved here. If a parent finds out their child is being taught by someone without proper credentials, Robert understands math better than many certified teachers I know, Margaret said, feeling her frustration rise. That's irrelevant, the principal said firmly. He doesn't have a degree in education, isn't registered with the board, and has no official qualifications to teach. And if the students' grades improve drastically, doesn't that count for anything? Margaret, Mrs. Sullivan said, you're being naive. Education isn't just about results. It's about process, qualifications, professional responsibility. So what are you asking me to do? We're asking you to lead the study groups alone, using pedagogically appropriate methods, Deborah said. And Robert? Robert should return to his regular cleaning duties. Margaret felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. What if I refuse? Then we'll have to cancel the study groups, the principal said simply. Is that fair to the students? It's fairer than exposing the school to unnecessary legal risks. Margaret looked from one to the other, seeing the resolve in their faces. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until Monday, Deborah said, and Margaret, we expect you to make the right choice. After they left, Margaret sank heavily into one of the student desks. Robert appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. I overheard part of the conversation, he said. Wasn't hard, they were talking pretty loud. Robert, I'm so sorry. No need to apologize, Ms. Wilson, I knew this might happen. But it's not fair. You're doing amazing work with those students. Life isn't always fair, Robert said philosophically. At least we helped some kids for a few weeks. I won't give up that easily, Margaret said with determination. There has to be a way. Ms. Wilson, it's not worth fighting the administration over me. You have a career to protect. It's not about you, it's about the students, it's about education, it's about what's right. Robert stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ms. Wilson, I learned long ago that some battles can't be won. What matters is knowing we did our best." Over the weekend, Margaret thought hard about the situation. She could accept the administration's demands and continue the study groups alone using traditional methods. That would be safer for her career and at least keep the students getting some math support. On the other hand, she had seen firsthand the transformative impact Robert had on the students. She knew his methods weren't just effective, they were necessary for these particular kids. Monday morning, she arrived at school with a decision. She found Deborah in her office before classes started. "Margaret," the principal said, "what's your decision about the study groups?" "I'd like to propose a compromise," Margaret said. "What kind of compromise?" "What if Robert took a teaching certification course or got some kind of math instruction?" "Certification?" Deborah raised an eyebrow. "Margaret, that would take months, maybe years, and even then he'd still officially be the school janitor. Then what if we offered him an official position as a teaching assistant?" "With what? Money? Our budget is already tight. He could keep some of his cleaning duties and dedicate part of his time to educational support." "Margaret, you're overcomplicating this. The solution is simple. You lead the groups alone, using approved methods. And we abandon the approach. That actually works for these students? We use the approach that is professionally appropriate." Margaret realized she was fighting a losing battle. The board's mindset was focused on protocols and appearances, not educational outcomes. "Can I have one more day to think about it?" she asked. "Of course, but tomorrow we need a final decision." That afternoon, Margaret looked for Robert in the schoolyard. "Robert, I need to talk to you about an idea." "Go ahead, Miss Wilson." "What if you enrolled to get a degree in mathematics, or at least finished high school and took a technical course in education?" Robert stopped sweeping and looked at her. "Ms. Wilson, we've talked about this before. It's not realistic. But what if it were? What if there was a way for you to study without leaving your job or responsibilities? How? Online courses, night classes, special programs for adults." Robert was silent for a moment. "Even if it were possible," he finally said, "it would take years. And in the end, even with a degree, who would guarantee me a job as a teacher? Who would believe a former janitor in his early 40s could be a good educator?" "I would believe it," Margaret said firmly, "and the students you've taught would, too." "Ms. Wilson, I appreciate the confidence, but I have to be realistic. I have bills to pay and daughters to raise. I can't afford to dream." "What if it wasn't a dream? What if it was a concrete plan?" "How so?" "Let me research the options. Let me see what programs exist, what financial support is available. I'm not asking you to decide now. Just don't dismiss the possibility completely." Robert sighed. "If you want to look into it, I won't stop you, but don't get your hopes up. Life has taught me not to expect more than the basics." "Sometimes," Margaret said, "it's exactly when we stop expecting that the best opportunities appear." That night, Margaret spent hours online researching adult education programs. She found several options: weekend high school completion courses, online degree programs with monthly in-person meetings, scholarships for students with specific socioeconomic profiles. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that it was possible. It would be hard, it would require sacrifices, but it was possible. The next morning, she approached Deborah Thompson with a different proposal. "Deborah," she said, "I have an idea about how to solve our study group situation." "I'm listening." "What if the school supported Robert in completing his education? We could help him enroll in training programs, maybe even offer some schedule flexibility so he can study." "Margaret, why are you so obsessed with this? Why can't you just accept that Robert is the janitor and you're the teacher?" The question hit Margaret like a slap. She realized Deborah saw the situation only through the lens of established hierarchies. "Because," she said slowly, "I believe talent and intelligence don't respect hierarchies. Because I've seen a man change the lives of students who were lost. Because I believe education should be about finding and developing potential, not keeping people in predetermined boxes." "Margaret, you're being too idealistic. The real world has structures, rules, expectations." And what if these structures are preventing us from providing the best possible education for our students? Then we work within the existing structures to improve gradually. Or we work to change the structures when they no longer serve us. Deborah Thompson sighed deeply. Margaret, I'll be very clear. You can continue the study groups, following the established protocols, or we can cancel the program entirely. Those are your options. What about Robert? Robert returns to his regular duties. Period. Margaret left the principal's office feeling defeated, but not broken. She had tried to work within the system, and the system had proven inflexible. Now she needed to decide whether to accept this limitation or find another way. During lunch, she met Robert in the teacher's lounge. "How did the meeting with the administration go?" he asked. "They won't budge," said Margaret. "They want me to continue the groups using traditional methods and have you go back to just cleaning. That's what I expected. But Robert, I haven't given up on the idea of you continuing your studies." "Ms. Wilson, let me finish. I've researched several options: weekend courses, distance learning, scholarships. And even if I managed it, then what? I'd still be the school janitor." "Maybe not at this school, but there are other schools, other opportunities." Robert looked at her with a mix of gratitude and skepticism. "Ms. Wilson, why is this so important to you?" The question made Margaret pause and reflect on her own motivations. "Because," she finally said, "in 20 years of teaching, I've never seen someone with your natural talent for education. Because I've watched you turn lost students into engaged learners. Because I believe everyone deserves the chance to reach their potential, no matter where they started in life." "And?" Robert asked, sensing there was more. "And because this school, this system made me realize I was stuck in a limited mindset too. You taught me that teaching isn't about credentials or titles. It's about connecting with people and helping them understand the world around them." Robert was silent for a long moment. "If I were to consider going back to school," he said cautiously, "what would happen to the study groups?" "I'd keep running them, using the methods you taught me. It wouldn't be the same, but it'd be better than traditional approaches. As and if, hypothetically, I managed to graduate and become a real teacher. What then? Then you'd have every opportunity you deserve, and who knows, maybe one day we could work together officially." Robert smiled for the first time in days. "You know what? My daughters always ask why I never went back to school. I always say I'm too old, that it's too late. But maybe they deserve to see their father try to reach his dreams. So you'll consider it?" "I'll consider it. No promises, no pressure." "No promises and no pressure," Margaret agreed. The following Saturday, Margaret led the third study group meeting alone. She tried using some of the methods she'd learned from Robert, but clearly didn't have his natural touch. "Ms. Wilson," Emily said at the end of class, "where's Mr. Robert today?" "He couldn't make it," Margaret replied, not wanting to lie outright. "Says he not helping with the study groups anymore?" Mark asked. "Well, there are some administrative things we're working out." "Does that mean he was banned from teaching?" Jason asked bluntly. Margaret was surprised by the boy's sharpness. "Why would you think that?" "Because I've been at this school for 3 years. I know how things work around here. If something is working well but isn't following traditional rules, they shut it down." "Jason, that's not exactly—" "Ms. Wilson, with all due respect, we're not fools. We noticed the difference between Mr. Roberts' classes and the regular ones, and we could tell you were nervous today, like you were afraid of doing something wrong." Margaret Wilson realized she had underestimated her students' emotional intelligence. "You're right," she admitted. "The administration didn't think it was appropriate for Robert to be officially involved in teaching because he doesn't have a formal education background." "That's nonsense," Emily said vehemently. "He teaches better than some of the teachers we've had." "I agree with you," Margaret replied. "But sometimes rules don't account for common sense." "So what now?" Mark asked. "Are we going back to boring math classes? I'll do my best to keep using the methods Robert taught us, but I admit it won't be the same." "Ms. Wilson," Jason said thoughtfully, "what if we did something?" "Like what?" "What if we showed the administration how much we really learned from Mr. Robert? Like taking a really hard test and getting high scores. Or writing a letter, explaining how he helped us," Emily suggested. "Or doing a presentation for parents showing how math makes sense now," Mark added. Margaret felt a wave of emotion seeing the students' engagement and loyalty. "Those are interesting ideas," she said carefully. "But I don't want you doing anything that could cause trouble for yourselves or Robert." "Ms. Wilson," Jason said, "seriously, did Mr. Robert cause trouble for us when he taught us math could be interesting? When he showed us we're smarter than we thought? Of course not. Then why would it be trouble to show that to others?" Margaret realized the students had a point. They weren't proposing anything destructive or disrespectful, just wanting to demonstrate the value of what they'd learned. "If you really want to do this," she said, "you need to do it the right way. With respect, solid evidence, and strong arguments." "We can do that," Emily said firmly. "And will you help us, Ms. Wilson?" Mark asked. Margaret paused. She could discourage them and maintain the status quo, or support them in an initiative. That, at the very least, would be a valuable exercise in citizenship and reasoning. "I'll help," she finally said, "but we'll do this properly." Over the next 2 weeks, the 8 students in the study group worked on a project they called Demonstrating the Impact of Contextualized Mathematics. They gathered data on their own grades before and after working with Robert, interviewed classmates and family about how their relationship with math had changed, and created presentations showing real-world math problems they'd learned to solve. Margaret was impressed by the seriousness and quality of their work. They were applying the exact kind of critical thinking and research skills the education system claimed to value. Emily created a detailed chart showing how her math average had risen from 4.2 to 7.8 in the last 4 weeks. Mark prepared a presentation on how math now factored into his future business plans. Jason wrote a 3-page essay titled, "How I Stopped Being Afraid of Numbers." "Miss Wilson," Emily said when they finished, "we want to present this to the administration and to our parents and to anyone else who will listen. Are you sure you want to do this?" "Absolutely," Mark said. "If we don't speak for ourselves, who will?" Margaret helped the students schedule a meeting with Principal Thompson and Mrs. Sullivan. She also suggested inviting some parents to attend the presentation. The following Thursday, in the school's meeting room, 8 ninth-grade students gave a 40-minute presentation on the benefits of contextualized mathematics education. Present were Principal Thompson, Mrs. Sullivan, 6 parents, including Mrs. Reynolds, Mark's mother, and Margaret. The presentation was flawless. The students spoke with passion and concrete data about how their experience with math had changed. They showed their improved grades, explained complex concepts using simple examples, and defended the importance of having teachers who understood their realities. "Principal Thompson," Jason said at the end of the presentation, "we're not asking to break rules or do anything illegal. We're just asking you to consider that maybe there are different ways to teach, and that some of those ways work better for some students. And we're asking," Emily added, "for you to acknowledge that Mr. Robert did something special for us. He taught us not just math, but to believe we're capable of learning anything." When the students finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. "That was a very impressive presentation," Principal Thompson finally said. "You clearly put a lot of effort into this. And the results in terms of grades are undeniable," Mrs. Sullivan added. "So will you consider letting Mr. Robert teach again?" Mark asked directly. Principal Thompson exchanged a glance with Mrs. Sullivan. "The situation is more complicated than you understand," the principal said. "There are legal, regulatory, and professional responsibility issues." "But what if he had the qualifications?" Emily asked. "What if he took the necessary courses to become an official teacher?" That would be different," Mrs. Sullivan admitted. At that moment, Mrs. Reynolds raised her hand. "May I ask something?" "Of course," Principal Thompson said. "As a mother, what matters most to me is whether my child is learning and feeling good at school. For the past 2 months, Mark has come home excited to study math. He talks about math problems at dinner. He makes plans that involve numbers and calculations." She paused. "Honestly, I don't care if the person teaching him has a diploma on the wall or not. I care if it's working." "I understand your point, Mrs. Reynolds," Principal Thompson said, "but we have responsibilities that go beyond immediate results." "What responsibilities are more important than giving our children the best education possible?" another parent asked. The question created tension in the room. "Look, Principal," Thompson said, clearly uncomfortable. "No one is questioning Robert's dedication or even his talent. But there are protocols in place for good reasons." "What reasons?" Jason asked bravely. "To ensure teachers have proper training to handle different educational situations, to protect students, to maintain quality standards." "But Mr. Robert has demonstrated quality," Emily said, "and he clearly knows how to handle our educational situations." Margaret decided to step in. "Principal Thompson, may I make a suggestion?" "Of course. What if we created a pilot program? Robert could enroll in teacher training courses while continuing to work here. During that time, he could officially assist in classes under my supervision. Once he completes the training, we could evaluate the possibility of an official teaching position." "How long would that take?" Mrs. Sullivan asked. "It depends on the program we choose." "But probably between 1 and 2 years." Deborah Thompson became thoughtful. "And during that time, would he keep his cleaning duties? Possibly on a reduced schedule to allow time for studies and teaching assistance. And who would pay for the courses? There are scholarships available, and perhaps the school could contribute a small portion, since it would be an investment in an employee's development." Deborah Thompson looked at the students, the parents, and then at Margaret Wilson. "I need to discuss this with the Department of Education," she finally said, "and with the school district board. I can't make a unilateral decision about something like this." "But will you consider it?" Mark asked hopefully. "I'll consider it, but I can't promise anything." After everyone left, Margaret Wilson went to find Robert Johnson, who was working in the schoolyard. "Robert, I need to talk to you about something important." "What is it, Ms. Wilson?" "The students made a presentation to the administration today about the impact you've had on their education." Robert stopped sweeping. "They did what?" "A full presentation with data, charts, testimonials. It was impressive." "And how did the administration react?" "They were impressed, but still concerned about formalities. However, I suggested a pilot program where you could get trained in education while working as an official assistant in math classes." Robert leaned on his broom. "And they agreed?" "They said they'll consider it. It needs approval from the Department of Education." "Ms. Wilson, even if they approve, this would mean a huge change in my life. I'd have to study, train, prove I'm capable." "You are capable, Robert. We all know you are." "But what if I fail? What if I realize that teaching a few kids on Saturdays is different from being a real teacher? What if you discover you're even better than you imagine?" Robert smiled sadly. "Ms. Wilson, I'm afraid of raising expectations and then not meeting them." "Robert, answer me honestly. Did you enjoy teaching those students?" "I loved it more than anything I've ever done." "And do you believe you made a difference in their lives?" "I do." "Then you already have your answer. The rest are just practical details we can work out." Robert was silent for a few minutes, watching the students moving around the yard. "If this works out," he finally said, "my daughters will be able to say their father is a teacher, not just a janitor, but a real teacher." "They can already be proud of the father they have," Margaret said. "But yes, imagine them telling their friends their dad is a math teacher." "And imagine," Robert said, his eyes lighting up, "being able to help hundreds of students like those 8, instead of just a few on Saturdays." "Now you sound like someone ready to embrace a new opportunity." "Maybe I am," Robert admitted. "For the first time in a long time, maybe I am." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. A week later, Deborah Thompson called Margaret and Robert into her office for a meeting. "I have news about the proposal we discussed," the principal said. "What kind of news?" Margaret asked. "I spoke with the superintendent of the municipal school district about your situation. I explained the impressive results you achieved with the students and the pilot program proposal." "And what was her reaction?" Robert asked nervously. "At first she was skeptical. She said there's no precedent for this kind of situation. But when I mentioned the concrete data on the students' improved grades, she became interested. Interested enough to approve the program." Asked Margaret. Interested enough to want to meet Robert in person. Robert paled. What do you mean, meet in person? She wants you to give a presentation to her and the educational team at the Department of Education. She wants to see with her own eyes how you teach and what results you can achieve. When? Asked Margaret. Next Tuesday. You'd have to give a demonstration lesson to a group of students struggling with math while they observe. Robert was visibly nervous. Principal Thompson, I've never done anything like this before. What if I freeze? What if I can't teach properly in front of all these important people? Robert, said Margaret firmly, you've already proven you know how to teach. Just be yourself and do what you always do. But this is different. These are education officials. They'll be analyzing every word I say, and they'll see exactly what we see, someone with a natural gift for teaching who connects with students in a special way. Deborah Thompson intervened. Robert, I understand your nervousness, but I want you to know I've already given my recommendation. If you can demonstrate on Tuesday what you've already shown here, I'm sure they'll be impressed. You really did that? Asked Robert, surprised. I did, because despite all my initial concerns about protocols and procedures, I can't ignore concrete results. And I also can't ignore the impact you've had, not just on the students, but on the teaching approach of the entire school. What do you mean? Asked Margaret. Other teachers have started asking about the methods you were using. The overall math grades for the whole school have improved slightly, even in classes that didn't directly participate in the project. Really? Said Robert, clearly moved. Absolutely. You've started a cultural shift in how we think about math education here. Robert took a deep breath. All right, he said. I'll do this presentation, but I'll need help preparing. Count on me, said Margaret immediately. And me too, added Deborah, surprising them both. Over the next few days, Robert, Margaret, and surprisingly Deborah worked together to prepare the presentation. The principal, who had initially been the biggest opponent of Robert's involvement, was now genuinely invested in his success. Robert, she said, during one of their prep sessions, I want to apologize for being so resistant at first. Sometimes when we're in administrative roles, we lose sight of what really matters, student success. No need to apologize, Principal. You were doing your job and protecting the school. But my job should be protecting and promoting the best possible education for our students. And clearly you provide that. On the eve of the presentation, Robert was visibly anxious. Margaret found him at the school, even though it was Sunday, organizing and reorganizing his materials. Robert, you need to relax a little. How can I relax? Tomorrow could change my whole life. Exactly why you need to relax. You won't teach well if you're too tense. Robert stopped shuffling papers and looked at her. Ms. Wilson, can I confess something? Of course. I've dreamed about this, literally dreamed. For years, I imagined myself in a classroom teaching students, seeing that moment when they finally understand something difficult. But I always thought, it was just a fantasy. And now? Now it's so close to becoming real that I'm afraid I'll mess it up. Robert, do you remember what you told Emily on the first day of the study group? About math just being a language few people truly understand? I remember. You're one of those people. And more than that, you can translate that language for those who don't understand it. That's a gift, not a skill you can lose from nervousness. But what if the people at the Department of Education don't like my approach? Then they're idiots, Margaret said simply. Robert laughed for the first time in days. Ms. Wilson, you can't call the superintendent an idiot. I can think it, even if I can't say it. On Tuesday morning, Lincoln Elementary School received a delegation from the municipal school district. Along with the superintendent, Dr. Elizabeth Parker, were the district curriculum coordinator, 2 educational supervisors, and a math specialist. Robert had chosen to work with a group of 10 students from different classes, all with a history of struggling in math. The lesson would focus on solving problems involving percentages and proportions. Good morning, everyone, Robert said once they were all gathered in the classroom. Good morning, Professor Robert, the students replied. The use of the word professor didn't go unnoticed by the observers. The students naturally saw him in that role. Today we're going to solve some mysteries, Robert said. Mysteries you encounter every day but might not realize are math problems. He walked to the board and wrote, Mystery 1. Why does my mom always check the change at the grocery store? The students laughed, immediately recognizing the situation. Who here has seen their mum or dad checking the change after shopping? Robert asked. Every hand went up. And does anyone know why they do that? To make sure they weren't cheated, one student answered. Exactly. And how do they know if they were cheated or not? By calculating. Another student said. Calculating what exactly? Robert guided the students through understanding that checking change involves calculating discount percentages, adding up multiple items, and verifying accuracy. He turned a simple everyday situation into a complex lesson on mathematical operations. The observers from the Department of Education took constant notes. Margaret, sitting at the back of the room, could see they were impressed by the students' engagement. Mystery 2, Robert wrote. Why can some people buy a house while others can't? This question led to a discussion about interest rates, financing, household income, and payment calculations. Robert used real data from the local housing market to teach advanced financial math concepts. Let's imagine John earns 2 minimum wages a month, he said. He wants to buy a house that costs $150,000. The bank offers financing at 8% annual interest to be paid over 20 years. Can he afford it? For the next 40 minutes, Robert guided the students through complex calculations, always connecting each mathematical operation to real-life decisions. The students didn't just learn how to calculate loan payments, they understood how these decisions affect families' lives. Now you see, Robert said at the end, why it's important to understand math. It's not just to pass a test, it's to make smart decisions in life. When the lesson ended, there was a moment of silence before the observers began applauding. The students, surprised but pleased, joined in. Robert, Dr. Elizabeth Parker said, that was one of the most impressive lessons I've witnessed in 15 years working in education. Thank you, Doctor, Robert said, clearly moved. You turned complex mathematical concepts into situations the students not only understood but saw themselves in. That's high-quality teaching. Thank you, Robert repeated, unsure. What else to say? I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind, of course. Where did you learn this teaching approach? Robert looked at Margaret before answering. I learned by observing the students, watching how they react to different kinds of problems. And I learned from my father, who always taught me that math makes sense when you connect it to real life. And how did you develop the skill to create such relevant, contextualized problems? I've worked at this school for 15 years. I know these students. I know their families. I know their realities. When you truly know your students, it's easy to create situations that make sense to them. The educational supervisor asked the next question. Robert, are you aware that you're applying very sophisticated teaching techniques, even without formal training in education? I don't know if they're sophisticated, Robert said humbly. I just know they work with these students. They work because they're based on solid educational principles, contextualized learning, connecting with students' prior experiences, practical application of abstract concepts. You're doing this intuitively. The math specialist added his own observation. Robert, in terms of mathematical content, you've covered concepts that are usually taught in fragments over several months. Percentages, proportions, compound, interest, data analysis. And you managed to integrate them so the students saw the connections between them. That's how math works in real life, Robert replied. Real problems don't come separated by chapters like in textbooks. Dr. Elizabeth Parker looked at her colleagues and then at Robert. Robert, I'd like to make you an official proposal. What kind of proposal? The Department of Education is willing to create a pilot program specifically for your situation. You'd be officially designated as a specialized teaching assistant while completing your education. Robert's eyes widened. How would that work? You'd work 20 hours a week as a teaching assistant, focusing on contextualized mathematics. The other 20 hours would be dedicated to studies, finishing high school, an education degree, and a specialization in mathematics education. And I'd get paid for this? You would. It wouldn't be a full teacher's salary yet, but it would be significantly more than what you earn now as a janitor. Robert looked at Margaret, who was smiling with tears in her eyes. How long would this whole process take, he asked. 3 years, 2 years to complete the basic education, plus 1 year for specialization and supervised training. At the end, you'd be a qualified teacher, eligible to apply for any math teaching position in the district. And during those 3 years, would I work here at Lincoln Elementary? If you want, yes. You'd work directly with Margaret, developing and implementing new math teaching methods. Robert was silent for a moment, clearly trying to process the magnitude of the offer. Can I have some time to think and talk to my family? Of course, but I'd like an answer by the end of the week. After the Department of Education team left, Robert sat at one of the student desks, still processing what had happened. I can't believe it, he said to Margaret. They're really offering this. You deserve it, Robert. You've proven you have an exceptional talent for teaching. But 3 years is a long time. Your daughters will have a father who's a teacher. They'll be proud of you in a whole new way. What if I can't do it? What if balancing work and studies is too hard? Then you'll have tried. And even if you don't finish everything, you'll still have learned a lot and helped many students along the way. Robert stood up and walked to the classroom window, looking out at the schoolyard where he knew every corner after 15 years of work. You know what amazes me the most about all this, he said. What? 3 months ago I was just the janitor, invisible to most people, and now important figures in education are talking about creating a special program for me. You were never just the janitor, Robert. You were always so much more than that. You just needed an opportunity to show it. And you gave me that opportunity. No, said Margaret firmly. You created that opportunity with your talent, your dedication, and your passion for teaching. I just recognized what was already there. That night, Robert went home and talked at length with his daughters about the offer. Bethany, 16, was moved by the possibility. Dad, you always helped me with math when I was little. I remember you explaining fractions using pizza slices. You've always been a teacher. You just didn't have the title. Chloe, 12, asked a practical question. Dad, if you become a real teacher, does that mean you'll make more money? It means I'll have more opportunities, sweetheart. And it means you and your sister can say your dad is a teacher. I already do, Chloe said simply. My friends always ask who taught me to be so good at math, and I tell them it was my dad. Her words touched Robert deeply. He realized his daughters had always seen the potential in him that he himself had doubted. On Thursday, Robert sought out Margaret at school. Ms. Wilson, I've made my decision. And what is it? I'm accepting the offer. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. Robert, I'm so happy you've made the right choice. I hope so, but I want you to know none of this would have happened without you. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And you taught me that teaching isn't about degrees or credentials. It's about passion, dedication, and the ability to connect with people. Will we still work together during these 3 years? If you want to, yes, we'll develop new methods, train other teachers, maybe even write a manual on contextualized mathematics. A manual? Robert said, surprised. Why not? You've developed an approach that clearly works. Other teachers and students could benefit. I never thought about writing anything. Well, you've got 3 years to think about it. On Friday, Robert called Dr. Elizabeth Parker and officially accepted the proposal. The pilot program would begin at the start of the next semester. The following Saturday, Robert led his last unofficial study group. The original 8 students were there, along with a surprise, 15 more who had asked to join after hearing about the original group's results. Everyone, Robert said, to the 23 students gathered in the room, I have some news to share. Are you going to tell us you're becoming a real teacher? Emily asked with a smile. How did you know? Everyone at school already knows, said Jason. It's the only thing students are talking about. And what do you all think about it? We think it's about time, said Mark. You've always been a teacher. You were just in the wrong job. And we also think, Emily added, that other students deserve the chance to learn math the way you teach it. Robert looked at the 23 young faces in the room, seeing the expectation and respect in their eyes. He thought about his journey, from an invisible janitor to a teacher recognized by the Department of Education. He thought of his daughters, who could now be proud to have a teacher for a father. he thought of Margaret, who had risked her own career to give him a chance. But most of all, he thought of the thousands of students who would pass through his classes in the coming years and the lives he could touch and transform. "Let's begin today's lesson," he said, turning to the board. "Today, we'll solve the mystery of how to turn dreams into concrete mathematical plans." And as he wrote on the board, Robert smiled, knowing his own life had become proof that sometimes the best teachers come from the most unexpected places, and that talent and passion can overcome any class barrier or social expectation. 3. Years later, Professor Robert Johnson graduated with a degree in education, specializing in mathematics education, earning the highest marks in his class. His thesis, Contextualized Mathematics, Connecting Numbers with Reality, became a reference for other educators in the region. At the graduation ceremony, his two daughters, Margaret and Deborah Thompson, Dr. Elizabeth Parker, and 56 of his former study group students were present. Emily, now a freshman in nursing, spoke on behalf of the students. "Professor Robert," she said in her speech, "you didn't just teach us math. You taught us that it doesn't matter where we come from or what our circumstances are. What matters is our dedication, our passion, and our willingness to learn and grow." At the end of the ceremony, when Professor Robert received his diploma, he looked at the audience and saw not just recognition of his personal achievement, but validation of a fundamental truth, that true education happens when teachers and students connect as human beings, regardless of titles or social positions. He thought of the boy who had helped his accountant father with calculations, the young man who had sacrificed his studies to care for his family, the man who had spent 15 years being invisible as a janitor, and finally the teacher he was becoming. All these versions of himself had contributed to who he was in that moment. And as applause echoed through the auditorium, Professor Robert knew his journey was only just beginning. End of story. Now, tell us what you thought of the story, and if you were moved by Robert's journey. Do you think he made the right decisions in accepting the challenge of becoming a teacher? We'd love to hear your thoughts on how small opportunities can completely transform lives. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.